Victoria. Ashford accessed the security footage to document why she was firing the janitor who wouldn't leave her autistic son alone. 12 monitors showed her the truth and she couldn't breathe through the sobbing. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The security office was silent except for the hum of 12 monitors casting their cold blue glow across Victoria Ashford's face. Her fingers were white where they gripped the edge of the desk, her perfectly manicured nails digging crescents into the laminate surface. On the largest screen in the center, frozen in time, was an image that had shattered her carefully constructed world in the span of 17 seconds. A janitor in a faded blue uniform sat cross-legged on the polished marble floor of the executive corridor, and beside him, looking more at peace than she had seen him in 3 years, was her son. But we should start at the beginning, 6 hours earlier, when Victoria Ashford was still certain she knew exactly who she was and what kind of mother she had become. The boardroom of Ashford Industries occupied the entire 42nd floor, a cathedral of glass and steel that looked down upon the city like a throne room surveying its kingdom. Victoria sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture rigid, her charcoal suit a suit of armor she wore to battle every single day. Around her, 12 executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as she dissected the quarterly projections with surgical precision. She had built this company from the ruins of her father's failed legacy, transforming a struggling manufacturing firm into a tech empire worth billions. She had done it alone, without help, without compromise, and without apology. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Miss Ashford, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but the school is calling. It's about Ethan." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Not now," she said, her voice clipped. "Tell them I'll call back after the meeting." There was a pause, a hesitation that made Victoria's stomach clench with a familiar dread. "They say it's urgent. He's had another episode." The room fell silent. Victoria felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes, some sympathetic, most simply uncomfortable with the intrusion of messy human reality into their sterile world of profit margins and growth strategies. She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that refused to tremble. "Excuse me," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. She took the call in her private office, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city she had conquered. The school counselor's voice was kind but firm, using the careful, therapeutic language Victoria had come to despise over the past 3 years. "Ethan had another meltdown during art class. He became overwhelmed by the texture of the paint, then fixated on arranging the brushes by size. When a teacher tried to redirect him, he threw the entire container of supplies across the room and locked himself in the supply closet. They had finally coaxed him out after 40 minutes, but he was nonverbal now, rocking back and forth, and they strongly suggested she come pick him up." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the familiar wave of helplessness crash over her. Helplessness was not an emotion she permitted herself in any other area of her life, but when it came to her son, she drowned in it daily. "I'll send someone," she heard herself say. "My driver can bring him home." "Mrs. Ashford," the counselor said gently, "I really think Ethan needs his mother right now." The words landed like an accusation. Victoria looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not a powerful CEO but a woman who sent drivers instead of going herself, who scheduled her son's therapy appointments around board meeting, who had convinced herself that providing the best specialists money could buy was the same thing as being present. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, ending the call before the counselor could respond. She brought Ethan back to the office because what else could she do? The boardroom full of executives was waiting, contracts needed signing, and her presence was non-negotiable. Ethan sat in the corner of her vast office, surrounded by the noise-canceling headphones and weighted blankets she kept there for these emergencies. He was 8 years old, with dark hair that fell across intelligent eyes that rarely met anyone's gaze. He wore his emotions like weather systems that arrived without warning. Right now he was calm, methodically sorting a pile of colored paper clips she had given him, arranging them by hue in a perfect gradient from red to violet. Victoria tried to focus on the contracts spread across her desk, but her attention kept drifting to her son. 3 years ago the diagnosis had arrived like an earthquake, shaking the foundation of everything she thought she understood about motherhood. Autism spectrum disorder, the specialist had said, as if those words explained everything and nothing all at once. He'll need support, structure, and most importantly, patience and understanding. Victoria had immediately hired the best therapists, enrolled him in specialized programs, and rearranged her office to accommodate it. What she had not done, what she could not seem to do, was rearrange herself. At 6:30, most of the office had emptied out. Victoria was still at her desk, now on a conference call with investors in Singapore, her voice steady and commanding as she defended a controversial acquisition. Ethan had grown restless an hour ago, pacing the perimeter of her office with increasing agitation. She had tried to soothe him during the brief pauses in conversation, offering snacks and different activities, but he was winding tighter, the signs of an impending meltdown building like storm clouds. When it finally broke, it was swift and devastating. Something in the cadence of her voice during the call triggered him, or perhaps it was was the fluorescent lights humming above, or the combination of sensory inputs that his brilliant, overwhelmed brain could no longer process. He swept the paper clips off her desk in one violent motion, then grabbed a crystal award from the shelf and raised it above his head. Victoria lunged forward, still holding the phone, trying to stop him, her professional voice cracking as she attempted to explain to confused investors why she needed to call back immediately. The award shattered against the wall and Ethan ran. Victoria chased him into the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble, her heart hammering with fear and frustration and a crushing guilt that never seemed to ease. She caught him at the elevator bank, pulling him into her arms as he thrashed and screamed. She felt the stares of the few remaining employees, saw them quickly avert their eyes, and she wanted to scream herself. She wanted to explain that her son was not a tantrum-throwing child, that his brain was wired differently, that every day was a battle to navigate a world that was too loud, too bright, too much. But she was Victoria Ashford, and Victoria Ashford did not explain herself to anyone. She held her sobbing son and waited for the storm to pass, her face a mask of control even as she crumbled inside. That was when she saw him. The night janitor, the one whose name she had never bothered to learn, was standing at the far end of the corridor with his cleaning cart. He was a man in his mid-40s, she guessed, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life lived largely in the background. He wore the standard blue maintenance uniform, and in all the months he had worked in this building, she had never once looked directly at him. He was part of the invisible infrastructure of her empire, as unremarkable as the electrical wiring or the HVAC system. She expected him to turn away, to give her privacy in this moment of maternal failure. Instead, he did something that struck her as profoundly inappropriate. He approached them. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't mean to intrude, but I might be able to help." Victoria looked up at him, her arms still wrapped around Ethan, who had begun to calm into exhausted whimpers. "Help?" she said, her voice sharp with defensive anger. "I don't think that's necessary. Please go about your work." The janitor hesitated, and she saw something flicker across his face. A knowledge, a recognition. He glanced down at Ethan, who had his face buried in Victoria's shoulder, and his expression softened. "I understand," he said simply, "but sometimes it helps to have someone who understands." Before Victoria could respond, before she could summon the authority to dismiss him, Ethan lifted his head and looked at the janitor. It was brief, just a moment of eye contact, but it was more than he had given anyone outside his immediate family in weeks. The janitor smiled. A small, sad smile that seemed to carry an entire story behind it. He slowly lowered himself to sit on the marble floor, his back against the wall, and he began to do something strange. He took a small flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on and off in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause. It was simple, predictable, and somehow impossibly, Ethan was watching. His breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of the light. The janitor said nothing, asked nothing, demanded nothing. He simply sat and created a pattern. A small island of predictability in the chaos. Victoria felt her son's body relaxing against her, felt the tension draining away like water through her fingers. She was simultaneously grateful and offended, relieved and threatened. Who was this man to succeed where she had failed? After 5 minutes, Ethan climbed out of her arms and took 2 small steps toward the janitor. The man didn't move, didn't reach out, just kept the light clicking in its steady rhythm. Then, for the first time in hours, Ethan spoke. He pointed at the flashlight and said one word: pattern. The janitor nodded slowly, as if this single word was the most profound thing he had ever heard. "That's right," he said softly. "It's a pattern. Would you like to try?" He held out the flashlight, and Ethan's miracle of miracles took it. Victoria stood watching, her professional armor cracking, as her son sat down beside a janitor and played with a light, creating patterns, finding calm in the presence of a stranger who seemed to understand what she, with all her resources, could not. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria Ashford stood frozen in her own hallway, watching her son interact with a man whose name badge she finally read from a distance: Marcus Chun. The janitor's movements were unhurried, almost meditative. He had produced a small notepad from his cart and was now drawing simple shapes, letting Ethan take the pen and trace over them, then create his own variations. There was no pressure, no expectation, no therapeutic agenda being pushed. It was just 2 human beings sitting on a floor, one offering calm and the other desperately accepting. Victoria's phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. The Singapore investors were calling back. Her assistant was sending urgent messages about tomorrow's shareholder meeting. The world she commanded was demanding her attention, pulling at her with invisible hooks, but she could not move. She was witnessing something she had paid countless specialists thousands of dollars to achieve, and it was happening for free on her marble floor with a maintenance worker and a flashlight. When Ethan finally stood up, he looked tired but settled. The way he looked after his worst storms had passed and left him wrung out but peaceful. He walked back to Victoria without prompting, slipping his small hand into hers. The janitor, Marcus, stood as well, brushing off his uniform pants with quiet dignity. He looked at Victoria, and in his eyes she saw something that made her deeply uncomfortable. It was not judgment, though she was prepared for that. It was understanding, tinged with a sadness that spoke of personal experience. "Thank you," Victoria heard herself say, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. She did not thank service workers. She did not engage with them beyond the transactional necessity, but this moment required acknowledgement even from her. Marcus nodded, a slight bow of his head. "He's a good kid," he said simply. Just needs the world to slow down sometimes. Victoria bristled at the casual assessment, the presumption that this stranger could know her son after 20 minutes. But Ethan was leaning against her leg, calm and present, and she could not summon her usual authority. How did you, she started, then stopped. How did you know what to do? Marcus's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face. I used to work with kids like Ethan, he said quietly, a long time ago. Then, as if realizing he had said too much, revealed too much, he stepped back toward his cart. I should get back. Have a good evening, Miss Ashford. He walked away before she could respond, pushing his cart down the corridor with the measured pace of someone who had perfected the art of being invisible. Victoria watched him go, 1,000 questions forming in her mind, but Ethan was tugging at her hand, asking in his quiet voice if they could go home now, and she let the moment pass. That night, after she had gotten Ethan settled at home, after his careful bedtime routine of weighted blankets and white noise and the precise arrangement of his stuffed animals, Victoria sat in her home office with a glass of wine she did not drink and thought about the janitor. Used to work with kids like Ethan. The phrase haunted her. What did that mean? Was he a former teacher, a therapist? And if so, why was he pushing a cleaning cart through her building at night? She did something she would later recognize as the first step down a path she never intended to walk. She opened her laptop and accessed the company's HR database. It took her only minutes to pull up Marcus Chun's employment file. The document was sparse, almost deliberately so. He had been hired 8 months ago as part of the night maintenance crew. His previous employment was listed as general labor at various warehouses and facilities across the state. There were no red flags, no gaps that couldn't be explained. But there was also nothing that suggested any professional background working with children. Victoria scrolled through the mandatory background check, which had come back clean. No criminal record, no concerning history, just a man in his mid-40s who cleaned office buildings at night. She was about to close the file when she noticed something. His emergency contact was listed as Westfield Memorial Hospital, with a note that any workplace injuries should be reported to a specific social workers extension. It was an unusual arrangement, typically the kind of thing she saw when employees were in recovery programs or transitional housing situations. She pulled up a search engine, a tool she rarely had to use herself, and typed in Marcus Chun's name along with variations of child therapy and behavioral specialists. For 30 minutes she found nothing. Then on a whim she added the word hospital to her search, combined it with autism services, and finally, buried 6 pages deep in the results, she found it. A tiny archived photograph from a hospital newsletter dated 9 years earlier. The photo showed a much younger Marcus Chun, his hair darker, his face fuller, standing in a brightly colored therapy room surrounded by children and their parents. The caption read, Marcus Chun, lead behavioral therapist at Westfield Pediatric Development Center, honored for his innovative sensory integration techniques. Victoria stared at the screen, her wine glass forgotten. A lead therapist, not just someone who worked with kids like Ethan, but someone who had been recognized for expertise in exactly the kind of support her son needed. She searched for more information about him, about what had happened in the 9 years between that photo and his current position mopping her floors, but she found nothing. It was as if Marcus Chun, the therapist, had simply vanished, and Marcus Chun, the janitor, had taken his place. The mystery of it gnawed at her, but more than that, she felt a cold anger building in her chest. This man had a skill set that could help her son, possibly change his life, and he was hiding it behind a mop and bucket. It felt like a betrayal, though she could not articulate why. It felt like he was withholding something that belonged to her. Over the next week, Victoria found herself looking for Marcus during her late evenings at the office. She would engineer reasons to stay past 6:30, working on tasks that could easily have been delegated, just to catch glimpses of him moving through the halls. She told herself it was due diligence, that she needed to observe him to understand whether he posed any risk or liability. But the truth, which she would not admit even to herself, was that she was fascinated by the contradiction he represented. She watched him work with a thoroughness that surprised her. He did not cut corners or rush through tasks. Every surface was cleaned meticulously, every trash can empty, every detail attended quiet focus. He was, she realized, good at his job in the same way she was good at hers. He brought professionalism and care to work that most people considered beneath notice. It made her earlier dismissal of him as merely part of the building's infrastructure feel suddenly shameful. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the incident in the hallway, Victoria made a decision. She brought Ethan to the office again, this time deliberately staying late, positioning them in her office during the hours she knew Marcus would be cleaning the executive floor. She felt manipulative doing it, using her son as a lure, but she justified it with the logic that had governed her entire life. She was a problem solver. Marcus represented a potential solution to her son's struggles. Therefore, engineering another encounter was simply good strategy. Ethan was playing with a set of connecting blocks on the floor of her office, building elaborate towers and knocking them down, when she heard the soft squeak of cleaning cart wheels in the hallway. She stood, smoothing her skirt, preparing the casual words she had rehearsed. Oh, Marcus, what a coincidence. I was hoping to speak with you. But when she opened her office door, she found Marcus standing in the hallway, not approaching her office, but deliberately moving away from it. He had seen them, she realized. He knew they were there, and he was avoiding them. The realization realization struck her like a slap. She was not accustomed to being avoided, to having her implicit invitations declined before they were even issued. She felt a rush of indignation, followed immediately by something more uncomfortable: hurt. She stepped into the hallway. "Marcus," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. He stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he did not turn around immediately. When he finally did, his face was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who had learned to school their features into professional blandness. "Yes, Miss Ashford?" His tone was respectful but distant, a clear boundary being drawn. "How can I help you?" Victoria walked toward him, aware that she was in her territory, her building, her domain, and yet somehow feeling like she was the one intruding. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, softening her voice in a way that felt foreign, "for last week, what you did for Ethan. It was very kind." Marcus nodded once, a slight dip of his head. "I'm glad he's doing well. If there's nothing else, I should get back to my work." He was dismissing her. In her own building, a janitor was dismissed. Victoria felt her professional armor sliding back into place, the vulnerable gratitude replaced by cold authority. "I looked you up," she said, abandoning the pretense of casual gratitude. "I know you were a therapist, a very accomplished one apparently. So I'm curious, Mr. Chun, why you're hiding that fact, why you're wasting your skills cleaning floors." Something flickered across Marcus's face, a crack in his careful control. It was not anger, but something deeper and more painful. Grief, perhaps. Or regret. "That's not your concern, Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "I do my job well. My past is my own business." Victoria took a step closer, her voice dropping to the low, commanding tone she used in negotiation. "When it affects my son, it becomes my business. You have skills that could help him. I'm prepared to name your price. I'll hire you as a private consultant. Whatever you were making as a therapist, I'll triple it." Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her falter. It was pity. He pitied her. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice gentle in a way that somehow made it worse, "you can't buy everything. Some doors close for a reason, and trying to force them open just because you have money doesn't make it right. I'm not qualified to help your son, not anymore." Victoria felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Then who is?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I've hired the best specialists in the country. They all speak in clinical terms and 5-year treatment plans, but none of them can do what you did in 20 minutes with a flashlight." "That wasn't therapy," Marcus said, his voice still quiet. "That was just one human being trying to help another. You don't need a license for that." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to push back, to assert the control she was losing, but Ethan appeared in the doorway of her office. He was holding one of his towers, carrying it carefully as if it might shatter. He walked down the hall toward them, his eyes fixed on Marcus. When he reached the janitor, he held up his creation, a perfect spiral of red and blue blocks. "Pattern," Ethan said, his voice clear and proud. Marcus's careful composure finally broke. His eyes shone with something that looked like pain and joy mixed together. "That's beautiful, buddy," he said softly. "You're really good at patterns." Ethan beamed, a rare full smile that Victoria saw maybe once a month if she was lucky. Then her son did something that made her heart stop. He took Marcus's hand and placed it on top of the tower, a gesture of sharing, of connection, of trust. Victoria watched as Marcus gently touched the blocks, his fingers tracing the pattern her son had created, and she realized with sudden, devastating clarity that whatever had happened to drive this man from his profession, whatever door he claimed had closed, her son had just become the key trying to open it again. Marcus Chun left work that night with the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He rode the bus to his small studio apartment in a neighborhood that had once been working class and was now just forgotten, watching the city lights blur past the smudged windows. The encounter with Victoria Ashford and her son had cracked something open inside him, something he had spent years carefully sealing away. He could still feel the small weight of Ethan's hand placing his own on that tower of blocks, still see the trust in the child's eyes, and it hurt in a way that felt both familiar and unbearable. His apartment was a study in deliberate minimalism. There were no photographs on the walls, no mementos of the life he used to live, just functional furniture, a neat stack of library books, and a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. He had designed the space to be forgettable, a place where memory could not take root. But tonight, as he sat on the edge of his bed, still wearing his work uniform, he could not stop the past from flooding back. 9 years ago, Marcus Chun had been at the pinnacle of his profession. The Westfield Pediatric Development Center had been his domain, a bright space filled with children who struggled to navigate a world not built for their minds. He had been gifted at reaching them, at finding the specific key that unlocked each unique child. Some people called it intuition, others called it talent, but Marcus had always known it was something simpler and more painful. He understood what it felt like to be trapped inside yourself, screaming at a world that could not hear you, because he had watched his younger sister live that reality every day of her short life. Lily had been the reason he became a therapist. She had been born when Marcus was 12, and from the beginning it was clear she experienced the world differently. She lived in a state of constant sensory overwhelm, unable to filter the barrage of sounds and lights and textures that others processed without thought. Their parents, Immigrants who had worked brutal hours to provide had no framework for understanding her needs. They loved her fiercely, but they were exhausted by her, frustrated by her, and eventually broken by her. Marcus had been the one who learned to soothe her. He discovered that certain patterns calmed her, that dim lights and soft sounds created islands of peace in her storm. He spent his teenage years becoming fluent in the language of her needs, sacrificing social life and normal adolescence to be her translator in a world that saw her only as difficult. When she died at 16, a seizure in her sleep that the doctors said was a tragic complication of her condition, Marcus had made a vow over her grave. He would help other children like her. He would be for them what he had been for his sister. For 15 years, he had kept that vow. He had built a career, a reputation, and a life centered on being the person who understood. Then, 3 years ago, he had met a child named Sophie. She was 7 years old, nonverbal, and so locked inside her own patterns that her parents were considering institutional care. Marcus had worked with her 3 times a week for 6 months, and he had seen progress. Small, incremental, but real. She had started making eye contact. She had begun to tolerate touch. She had shown in a dozen tiny ways that she was learning to bridge the gap between her world and theirs. Then, during a routine therapy session, Sophie had a seizure. It was not her first. Her medical history documented a seizure disorder that was being managed with medication, but this one was different. It was violent and prolonged, and despite Marcus's immediate response and the paramedics arriving within minutes, Sophie had suffered catastrophic brain damage. She survived, but the little girl who had been slowly emerging disappeared, replaced by a child who would require total care for the rest of her life. The investigation had cleared Marcus of any wrongdoing. The seizure was a documented risk, unrelated to his therapy. The family did not blame him, which somehow made it worse. They sent him a letter thanking him for the months of progress, telling him that the brief light they had seen in their daughter's eyes had been a gift. But Marcus could not absolve himself. He had been the professional, the expert, the one who promised to help. He had been responsible for Sophie during the moment her life changed forever, and no amount of clinical explanation could ease the guilt that consumed him. He resigned from the center the day Sophie was discharged to a long-term care facility. He surrendered his license, refusing to even consider returning to practice. His colleagues had tried to convince him otherwise, told him he was too talented to waste, that children needed him, but Marcus knew a truth they did not. He had failed at the one moment that mattered most. He had been unable to protect a vulnerable child in his care. How could he ever trust himself with that responsibility again? So he had disappeared. He took jobs that required only physical labor, work where the stakes were low and the damage he could do was minimal. He mopped floors, unloaded trucks, stocked shelves. He lived small and quiet, and he told himself that this was penance, this was appropriate. He had no right to the life he used to live. Until last week, when a little boy in distress had looked at him and Marcus's instincts had overridden his carefully constructed walls. He had helped Ethan without thinking, without permission, and in doing so, he had violated the exile he had imposed on himself. Now Victoria Ashford wanted to pull him back into that world, wanted to hire him, wanted to make him responsible again. The thought filled him with a terror so profound it made his hands shake. He could not do it. He would not. Tomorrow he would go to work and he would avoid the executive floor. He would disappear back into invisibility where he belonged. But the next morning, as Marcus was preparing for another day of deliberate anonymity, his phone rang. It was his supervisor, Jerry, a gruff man who ran the maintenance department with efficient indifference. "Chun, I got a weird call from HR," Jerry said without preamble. "The CEO wants you transferred to day shift, permanent assignment to the executive floors, effective immediately." Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was Victoria's doing. She was using her power to force proximity to make avoidance impossible. "I prefer night shift," Marcus said carefully. "Is there any way to decline the transfer?" Jerry laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "Decline? Chun, when the CEO personally requests something, you don't decline. You say thank you and you show up. You start Monday. Congratulations, I guess. You're moving up in the world." The line went dead. Marcus sat in his small apartment, his phone still pressed to his ear, felt the walls he had built beginning to crumble. Victoria Ashford was not a woman accustomed to hearing no, and she was systematically removing every barrier he tried to erect. Part of him, a small, treacherous part, felt something other than dread. It felt like relief. The exhaustion of hiding from himself was, he realized, becoming unbearable. On Monday morning, Marcus reported to the executive floor in the harsh light of day. Everything looked different in the sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The marble gleamed, the glass conference room sparkled, and the world of Victoria Ashford's domain seemed even more intimidating without the softening cover of darkness. He was assigned to maintain the executive washrooms, conference areas, and private offices. It was make work, he realized immediately. These spaces were already pristine, cleaned by the night crew. This was Victoria creating a reason for him to be present. He saw her briefly that first morning. She swept past him in the corridor, surrounded by assistants, her phone pressed to her ear, her stride purposeful and commanding. She did not acknowledge him, did not even glance in his direction, but Marcus knew she was acutely aware of his presence. He was a piece she had moved on her chessboard, and she was waiting to see how he would respond. For 3 days, Marcus maintained his boundaries. He did his assigned tasks with meticulous care and avoided any situation where he might encounter Ethan. He ate lunch alone, kept his head down, and spoke to no one beyond what was professionally necessary. He was determined to prove that proximity did not equal accessibility, that Victoria Ashford could not force him into a role he refused to play. Then, on Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Marcus was restocking supplies in a storage closet on the 42nd floor when he heard it. The sound was faint at first, a high-pitched keening that made his body respond before his mind caught up. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a child in profound distress. He stepped into the corridor and followed the sound to its source. One of the smaller conference rooms, the kind used for private meetings. Through the frosted glass, he could see shapes moving, hear raised voices mixing with the child's cries. Marcus stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to walk away, to remain invisible, to protect himself. This was not his responsibility. This was not his child. This was not his place. But the crying intensified, became the kind of desperate sound that spoke of a nervous system completely overwhelmed, and his feet were moving before he gave them permission. He opened the conference room door. Inside, he found chaos. Ethan was on the floor in the corner, his body rigid, his hands clasped over his ears, rocking violently. Victoria was crouched in front of him, her usually perfect composure shattered, trying desperately to comfort him. Behind them stood 3 men in expensive suits, looking deeply uncomfortable, and a woman Marcus recognized from the HR department who was speaking rapidly into her phone. "We need medical," she was saying. "The child is having some kind of attack." Not an attack, Marcus heard himself say. A meltdown. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Victoria's face was streaked with tears. She probably did not know she was crying. "Marcus," she whispered, the word a plea. "I don't know what happened. We were just talking, and he started asking about the lights, and then everything just fell apart. I don't know how to help him." Marcus felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. He moved into the room, kneeling on the floor a few feet from Ethan. He did not touch the child, did not speak, did not make demands. He simply pulled out the small flashlight he still carried in his pocket, clicked it on, and began creating a pattern. The same pattern from a week ago. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause. Simple, predictable, safe, and slowly, impossibly, Ethan's rocking began to synchronize with the rhythm of the light. The conference room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Marcus's flashlight. Victoria remained frozen in her crouch, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile magic was taking hold. The 3 executives who had been meeting with her exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable, but none of them dared speak or leave. Even the HR woman had stopped her frantic phone call, watching with wide eyes as the janitor worked a miracle with nothing but light and patience. Ethan's rocking slowed incrementally, his breathing evening out as his nervous system found anchor in the predictable pattern. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Marcus never broke the rhythm, never spoke, never pushed. He simply existed as a steady presence, offering structure in the chaos. Finally, Ethan's hands dropped from his ears. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, tracked the movement of the flashlight. Then, in a gesture that made Victoria's breath catch, her son reached out his hand toward Marcus. Marcus met him halfway, letting Ethan's small fingers wrap around his wrist. The physical contact seemed to complete some circuit, and Ethan took a shuddering breath that signaled the worst had passed. "Too bright," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. "The lights are too bright and they hum. I can hear them humming inside my head." Marcus nodded slowly, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I know, buddy. Sometimes the world is too loud, isn't it? Would it help if we made it darker in here?" Ethan nodded, still clinging to Marcus's wrist. Marcus looked up at Victoria for the first time since entering the room. His eyes asked a silent question, and she nodded frantically, giving permission she knew she should not need to give in her own conference room. Marcus reached up with his free hand and switched off the overhead fluorescence. The room dimmed immediately, lit only by the gray daylight filtering through the frosted glass. The relief on Ethan's face was instantaneous. "Better?" Marcus asked. Ethan nodded again, his grip on Marcus's wrist loosening slightly. The janitor glanced at the assembled executives, his expression making his request clear without words. Victoria stood on shaky legs, her professional mask attempting to reassemble itself. "Gentlemen, Miss Chun, I apologize. We'll need to reschedule this meeting. Please give us the room." The executives filed out quickly, grateful for the escape. Victoria could see the judgment in their eyes, the questions they would ask later. The CEO's child having a breakdown during a business meeting. What kind of mother brings her unstable child to work? When the door closed behind them, sealing the 3 of them in the dimmed conference room, Victoria felt something inside her break. She sank into one of the leather chairs, her hands shaking, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to show weakness in front of another adult. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I could handle a 30-minute meeting. His therapist called in sick. The backup sitter canceled, and I had a merger negotiation that couldn't be postponed. I thought he would be fine in here with his tablet. I thought I was managing it." Marcus was still on the floor with Ethan, but he turned his head to look at her. His expression held no judgment, only a tired understanding. "You can't manage everything, Miss Ashford. Sometimes kids like Ethan, they're like seismographs. They feel every tremor in the world around. The stress you were carrying into that meeting, the tension from those executives, the fluorescent lights humming at a frequency most people don't notice. It all added up. It wasn't your fault. The kindness in his words undid her completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tears she would be mortified by later but could not control now. He needs more than I can give him, she said, the admission tearing out of her like a confession. I can run a company worth billions. I can negotiate with hostile board members and hostile governments, but I cannot give my son what he needs. Every day I fail him, and I don't know how to stop failing. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Ethan had released his wrist and was now sitting cross-legged, playing with the flashlight himself, clicking it on and off with focused attention. You're not failing him, Marcus finally said. You're just trying to do everything alone, and this is not something anyone can do alone. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic it felt like someone else's body. I've hired specialists. I've read every book. I've implemented every strategy they suggest. Nothing works the way it should. That's because there is no should, Marcus said gently. There's just Ethan, and he's not a problem to be solved. He's a person to be understood. The words hit her like a revelation and a rebuke all at once. She realized that she had been approaching her son the way she approached her business, as a challenge to be overcome, a puzzle to be solved with the right strategy and sufficient resources. But Ethan was not a quarterly earnings report. He was a child who needed something she did not know how to provide. Will you help him? The question left her mouth before she could stop it, naked and desperate. Please, I know you don't want to. I know you have reasons and I won't pry into them, but my son trusts you. I've never seen him trust anyone this quickly. Whatever I was paying you before, whatever I offered, forget it. Name your terms. Anything. Marcus closed his eyes, and Victoria saw war playing out across his features. When he opened them again, they held a deep sadness. You don't understand what you're asking, he said quietly. I'm not qualified anymore. I walked away from this for a reason, Miss Ashford. A very good reason. People get hurt when I'm responsible for them. Victoria leaned forward, her voice fierce despite the tears still wet on her face. People get hurt when I'm responsible for them too. Look at him. Look at my son, having a meltdown during a business meeting because I brought him to work. We're all failing in our own ways, Marcus. The only question is whether we fail alone or whether we try to fail better together. The silence stretched between them. Ethan had abandoned the flashlight and was now drawing patterns in the condensation on the glass conference table, his finger tracing loops and spirals, lost in his own world. Marcus watched him with an expression so tender it made Victoria's chest ache. I can't make promises, Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't guarantee outcomes. Can't be what I used to be, but I can if you'll let me spend time with him. Not as a therapist, not officially, just as someone who understands. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. It's enough, she managed. It's more than enough. That evening, after Marcus had helped them get Ethan calm enough to leave the building, after she had driven her son home and settled him with dinner and his favorite weighted blanket, Victoria sat in her home office and made a decision that would change everything. She drafted an internal memo promoting Marcus Chun from maintenance staff to executive assistant for special projects, REPORTING, directly to her. The salary she assigned was absurd for the role, but she did not care. She needed him accessible, needed him close, needed him to feel obligated to stay. She also did something else, something she would later recognize as the beginning of her obsession. She called the head of security and requested access to all footage from the executive floor for the past month. She wanted to see Marcus when he thought no one was watching, wanted to understand who he was when he was not performing for her. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. CEOs occasionally reviewed security footage for various reasons. No one questioned her. The files arrived in her email within an hour. Dozens of video files organized by date and camera location. Victoria opened them one by one, fast-forwarding through hours of empty corridors and mundane cleaning tasks. She was about to give up, about to accept that there were no secrets to uncover, when she found it. Footage from 2 weeks ago, from a camera in the corridor outside her office. The timestamp read 11:47 at night. The hallway was empty except for Marcus and his cleaning cart, but he was not cleaning. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, and he was crying. Not quiet, dignified tears, but the kind of sobbing that came from somewhere deep and broken. His shoulders shook with it, his hands covering his face, and he looked like a man who had carried a burden too heavy for too long. Victoria watched him cry for 7 minutes before he finally pulled himself together, stood up, and went back to work as if nothing had happened. She rewound the footage and watched it again, trying to understand what had triggered such profound grief. She checked the date. It was the night after his first encounter with Ethan, the night after he had helped her son with the flashlight. Whatever had driven Marcus from his profession, whatever door he insisted had closed, helping Ethan had reopened a wound that had never truly healed. Victoria sat in the glow of her computer screen, watching a man she barely knew break apart in a lonely hallway, and she felt something shift inside her. She had been so focused on what Marcus could do for her son, on how his skills could solve her problem, that she had not stopped to consider what price he might pay for providing that help. She had been, she realized with shame, treating him exactly the way she treated everyone else, as a resource to be acquired and deployed. She closed the laptop, the image of Marcus's grief burned into her mind. The next morning she found him in the small office she had assigned him, converted storage room that still smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. He was reading through files she had prepared, documentation of Ethan's various diagnoses and treatment plans. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded. "Miss Ashford," he said, standing. "I was just reviewing." "Sit, please," she interrupted, then softened her tone. "I wanted to establish some ground rules. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Marcus sat slowly, wariness in every line of his body. "First," she continued, taking the chair across from his desk, "you will tell me immediately if this becomes too much. If working with Ethan triggers anything you can't handle, you walk away. No consequences, no judgment. Second, you will never be required to do anything you're uncomfortable with. This is not an order, Marcus. It's an invitation, and you can decline it at any time. Do you understand?" Marcus studied her face, clearly trying to discern the angle, the hidden agenda. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Yesterday you were offering me any price. Today you're giving me an exit strategy." Victoria met his eyes. "Because I saw something I shouldn't have seen." She paused, knowing she was about to reveal her invasion of his privacy, but unable to find another way to make him understand. "I reviewed security footage. I saw you crying in the hallway after you first helped Ethan. Whatever pain you're carrying, I don't want to make it worse." Marcus's face went pale, then flushed with something between anger and humiliation. "You were watching me?" Victoria held her ground. "I was trying to understand who you were. I was trying to protect my son, but what I saw, it made me realize that maybe my son isn't the only one who needs help." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need your charity, Miss Ashford. I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Victoria said firmly, standing as well. "It's respect. You're in pain, Marcus, and I'm asking you to take on something that might make that pain worse. The least I can do is acknowledge that cost." Marcus stared at her, his jaw working, emotions warring across his face. Finally, he sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "You don't know what you saw," he said quietly. "You don't know what it meant." "Then tell me," Victoria said, sitting as well. "Help me understand." And for the first time, in a converted storage room that smelled of pine cleaner, Marcus Chun began to tell her about Sophie. Marcus Chun had not spoken Sophie's name aloud in 3 years. The syllables felt strange in his mouth, like a word from a forgotten language. Victoria Ashford sat across from him in the cramped office that still carried the ghost of industrial cleaner. And she waited. She did not push, did not prompt, did not check her phone or glance at her watch. She simply waited with the kind of patience Marcus suspected she rarely showed anyone. "Sophie was 7 when I met her," Marcus began, his voice low and careful, as if the words might shatter if spoken too loudly. "She was nonverbal, lived entirely in her own patterns. Her parents brought her to the center after 3 other facilities had suggested institutionalization. They were exhausted, broke, and running out of hope. I should have known better than to take her case. I should have recognized that I was too invested, that she reminded me too much of my sister, but I thought I could help. I thought I was the one person who could reach her." He paused, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. Victoria noticed his knuckles were white. "For 6 months we worked together 3 times a week. It was slow progress, the kind that doesn't look like much in clinical notes but feels like miracles when you're living it." She started making eye contact. She let me touch her hand. She began to show me her patterns instead of just living in them. Her parents cried the first time she looked at them directly. They said I had given them their daughter back. The silence filled the room. Marcus's jaw worked as he struggled with what came next. Then, during a routine session, she had a seizure. She had a documented seizure disorder. It was managed with medication, but this one was catastrophic. I did everything right. I called for help immediately. I kept her safe. I followed every protocol. The paramedics arrived within 4 minutes. But it didn't matter. The seizure caused massive brain damage. She survived, but the little girl I had been working with, the one who was just starting to emerge, she was gone. Victoria felt tears pricking her eyes, but forced them back. This was not her pain to center. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes haunted. "She's in a long-term care facility in Pennsylvania. She requires total care now. Feeding tube, around-the-clock nursing. She's 10 years old, and she'll never be more than she is in this moment." Her parents sent me a letter after she was settled, thanking me for the months of progress they got to witness. They didn't blame me. No one blamed me except myself. "But you left your profession," Victoria said, understanding dawning. "You walked away because of something no one held you responsible for." Marcus's laugh was bitter and broken. "Responsibility isn't about blame, Miss Ashford. I was the professional. I was the one who promised to help. I was the one in charge when her life changed forever. The investigation cleared me, said it was an unpredictable medical event, but I know the truth. I failed to protect a vulnerable child when she was in my care. How could I ever trust myself with that responsibility again?" Victoria leaned forward, her voice firm but gentle. "So you decided to punish yourself for the rest of your life? To waste your gift because of one tragedy you couldn't prevent?" Marcus's eyes flashed. "It's not about punishment. It's about prevention. I can't fail another child if I never allow myself to be responsible for one. Don't you understand? When I helped your son that first night, I violated every rule I set for myself. I swore I would never put myself in that position again. Never let a child depend on me. Never risk being the reason another family's life falls apart. Then why did you help him? Victoria challenged. Why didn't you just walk away? Marcus's expression crumbled. Because I couldn't, he whispered. I saw him in distress, and every instinct I spent 3 years trying to bury came roaring back. I saw my sister. I saw Sophie. I saw every child I ever worked with. And I saw a little boy who needed someone to understand, and I couldn't walk away. I tried. God knows I tried, but I couldn't. Victoria reached across the desk and did something she had never done with an employee. She took his hand. Her touch was warm, steady, and it made Marcus's carefully constructed composure finally collapse. He bent forward, his shoulders shaking, and wept. Not the private, lonely crying she had witnessed on the security footage, but the kind of grief that required a witness, that demanded acknowledgement. Victoria held his hand and let him break apart, understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for another person was simply refuse to look away from their pain. When Marcus finally regained control, pulling back and wiping his face with embarrassment, Victoria spoke. My husband left when Ethan was 5. She said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing a business transaction. He said he couldn't handle it, couldn't handle having a son who would never be normal. Those were his exact words. Never be normal. He walked out on a Tuesday morning, and I haven't seen him since. No calls, no letters, no birthday cards, just gone. Marcus looked at her, seeing her differently now. She continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of old pain. For the first year, I told myself I was better off without him, that Ethan was better off without a father who couldn't accept him. I threw myself into work, hired the best therapists, and convinced myself that money and resources could compensate for the hole my husband left. But here's what I learned. Grief makes liars of us all. I wasn't better off. Ethan wasn't better off. We were just alone. She squeezed his hand before releasing it. So I understand walking away from something that hurts too much to face. I understand building walls and telling yourself you're doing the right thing. But I also understand that those walls eventually become prisons. You isolated yourself to prevent another tragedy, Marcus. But in doing so, you created a different kind of tragedy. All the children you could have helped over these 3 years, all the families you could have given hope to, they lost out because you couldn't forgive yourself for being human. The words should have felt like an attack, but coming from her, they felt like absolution. Marcus took a shaky breath. What if I fail again? What if something happens to Ethan while he's with me? What if, Victoria interrupted, her voice gentle but firm, what if you succeed? What if you help my son learn to navigate a world that feels too bright and too loud? What if your gift, the one you've been hiding behind a mop and bucket, changes his life? Are you really going to deny him that possibility because you're afraid? Marcus sat with the question, feeling the weight of 3 years of self-imposed exile pressing against the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could step back into the light. I can't promise miracles, he said finally. I can't promise I won't break down. I can't promise I'll be what I used to be. I'm not asking for promises, Victoria replied. I'm asking for presence. Show up for my son the way you showed up that first night. Bring your flashlight and your patience and your understanding. The rest we'll figure out together. The word together hung between them, carrying a weight neither of them fully understood yet. For Victoria Ashford, who had built an empire on self-reliance, the concept of partnership was foreign territory. For Marcus Chun, who had spent 3 years deliberately disconnected from meaningful human connection, it was terrifying. But in that moment, in an office that smelled of pine cleaner and second chances, they both nodded. For the following weeks, a routine emerged. Marcus would spend an hour each afternoon with Ethan in a small room Victoria had converted into what she called a sensory space. She had consulted with him on the design, and together they had created an environment that honored Ethan's need. Soft lighting, noise-dampening panels, a variety of textures and patterns, and most importantly, no expectations. Marcus never pushed, never demanded, never imposed structure. He simply existed as a calm presence while Ethan explored his world. Sometimes they played with the flashlight, creating patterns of light and shadow. Sometimes Marcus would bring simple objects, smooth stones or pieces of fabric with interesting texture, and they would explore them together in silence. Sometimes Ethan would talk, his words tumbling out in a stream of consciousness about the things that fascinated and frightened him. Marcus listened. Truly listened, in a way that made Ethan feel heard for perhaps the first time in his life. Victoria would watch sometimes through the window in the door. Though she tried not to make her observation obvious, she saw her son relax in ways she had never witnessed, saw him smile with a freedom he never showed in therapy sessions with the expensive specialists. She also saw Marcus transform. The guarded, broken man who had wept in her office was still there, but increasingly she saw glimpses of who he must have been before. Patient, intuitive, fully present. He was, she realized, coming back to life. The transformation was not linear. There were days when Marcus would arrive at work with shadows under his eyes, when the weight of old guilt pressed down on him so heavily he could barely function. On those days, Victoria learned to give him space while still making clear he was not alone. She would leave a cup of coffee outside his office door or send a brief email with nothing but a link to an article she thought might interest him. Small gestures that said, I see you struggling and you don't have to hide it. There were also days when Ethan regressed, when the progress they had seen evaporated and he was lost in patterns and overwhelm. On those days, Marcus had to fight every instinct that screamed, this is happening again, you're failing again, you should run, but he stayed. He stayed because Victoria was there beside him, her presence a reminder that that failure was not catastrophe, that setbacks were part of the journey, that he was not alone in this. They began to talk, really talk. During the quiet moments between sessions, Victoria told him about her father's failed business, about the shame of growing up with a family name synonymous with bankruptcy, about her relentless drive to prove she was different. Marcus told her about his sister, about the guilt of surviving when she did not, about the years he spent trying to save children, as if each one saved could somehow redeem his inability to save her. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Victoria found Marcus in the sensory room, sitting in the dimmed light. Ethan had gone home an hour ago, but Marcus remained, staring at nothing. She knocked softly on the open door. "Mind if I join you?" He shook his head and she entered, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I called Sophie's parents today." Victoria turned to look at him, her eyes wide. It was the first time in 3 years. I asked how she was doing. There was a long pause, and Victoria prompted gently. Marcus's voice was thick with emotion. Her father said she smiles sometimes. They don't know why, and she doesn't respond to anything specific, but occasionally she just smiles. He said he likes to think she's remembering the summer before the seizure, when she was making progress. He said he still thanks God for those 6 months when they got to know their daughter. A tear traced down Marcus's cheek. "He told me I gave them a gift, Victoria. Even knowing how it ended, he said I gave them a gift." Victoria reached over and took his hand, the gesture becoming familiar between them. "You did," she said simply. "You gave them hope and memories and 6 months of connection they never thought they'd have. The tragedy that followed doesn't erase that gift, Marcus. It doesn't undo the good you did." Marcus turned to her, and in his eyes she saw something shifting, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. "Maybe you're right," he whispered. "Maybe I've been so focused on the ending that I forgot about the story that came before it. Maybe that's the real tragedy." They sat together in the dimmed light, two people who had built walls around their hearts, and those walls continued to crumble brick by brick. The weeks accumulated into months, and the architecture of their lives began to shift in ways both profound and subtle. Marcus was no longer the invisible janitor haunting the night corridors. He had an office, modest though it was, and a purpose that made him arrive early and leave late. Ethan was no longer the disruption Victoria tried to manage around her schedule, but the center point around which her days organized themselves. And Victoria, a steel-spine CEO who had never needed anyone, found herself needing Marcus Chun in ways that went far beyond his ability to help her son. It was a Thursday afternoon in late autumn when everything began to unravel, though none of them recognized the moment for what it was. Victoria had a critical board meeting scheduled, the kind where her leadership would be questioned and her decisions scrutinized. The company was pursuing an aggressive acquisition that had divided opinion, and several board members were openly hostile. She needed to be sharp, commanding, unassailable. She needed to be the Victoria Ashford who had built an empire from ruins. That morning, Ethan's school had called. There had been an incident during lunch, a sensory overload triggered by the cafeteria noise, and he had locked himself in a bathroom stall and refused to come out. They needed her to pick him up. Victoria had stood in her office, phone pressed to her ear, calculating the impossible mathematics of her life. The board meeting was in 3 hours. The school was 40 minutes away. There was no time. She had called Marcus without thinking, the reflex so natural now it did not register as significant. "Can you go get him?" she had asked, then immediately felt the presumption of it. "I know it's not part of your job description, but I'm completely trapped here and he trusts you and I just need—" "I'll go," Marcus had interrupted quietly. "Text me the address. I'll bring him back here." An hour later, Marcus returned with Ethan, who was subdued but calm. Victoria had emerged from a pre-meeting prep session to find them in the sensory room. Marcus sitting on the floor while Ethan lay on his stomach, tracing patterns on a piece of paper. The sight of them, the quiet piece of the scene, had made her throat tight. "Thank you," she mouthed through the window. Marcus had simply nodded, his attention never leaving Ethan. The board meeting was a battlefield. For 2 hours, Victoria defended her strategy, parried attacks, and maintained control by sheer force of will. She emerged victorious but exhausted, her carefully constructed armor dented and strained. When she returned to her office, she found a note on her desk in Marcus's neat handwriting. "Ethan is resting in the sensory room. He had a snack and did some drawing. He's okay. You're doing a good job, Victoria. Don't forget that." The last sentence undid something in her. She sat at her desk, this woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated with titans of industry, and she cried over a simple note that told her she was doing a good job. Because no one else ever said that to her. No one acknowledged the impossible balance she was attempting, the daily calculus of being both CEO and mother to a child who needed more than she could give. But Marcus saw it. Marcus understood. That evening, after Ethan had been picked up by the new aide Victoria had hired, she found Marcus packing up his office for the night. She knocked on his open door, suddenly uncertain. "Do you have dinner plans?" The question came out more hesitant than she intended. Marcus looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "No. I usually just grab something on the way home." "Why?" "Because I want to take you to dinner," Victoria said, then quickly added to say thank you. "For today. For everything." "It's not necessary," Marcus began, but Victoria held up a hand. "I know it's not necessary. I want to. Please." There was something in her voice, a vulnerability he had learned to recognize. that made refusal impossible. Okay, he said softly. Dinner would be nice. They went to a small Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the office, the kind of place Victoria would never normally choose. No celebrity chefs, no impossible reservations, just red-checked tablecloths and generous portions. They sat in a corner booth, and for the first time they were not CEO and employee, not mother and helper, just 2 people sharing a meal. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything and nothing. Books they loved, cities they had visited, the small details of their lives that never came up in the fluorescent-lit confines of the office. Victoria found herself laughing, really laughing, at Marcus's story about a disastrous camping trip his sister had convinced him to take when they were teenagers. He's a good storyteller, animated and self-deprecating, and, she realized she was seeing yet another layer of the man he had been before grief had hollowed him out. "You should laugh more often," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes warm. "It transforms your whole face." The compliment caught her off guard. She felt heat rising to her cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation. "I don't have much to laugh about usually," she said, trying to deflect. "That's not true," Marcus replied gently. "You have Ethan. You have this incredible company you built. You have more than most people ever dream of, but you're so busy managing everything that you forget to enjoy any of it." The observation stung because it was accurate. When was the last time she had done something purely for joy? When had she last allowed herself to simply exist without an agenda or a goal? "I don't know how to do that," she admitted quietly. "How to just be. I've spent my entire adult life proving something to my father's ghost, to the people who doubted me, to myself. I don't know who I am when I'm not fighting." Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent electricity up her arm, a sensation she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "Maybe that's something we can figure out together," he said. "How to be people instead of just survivors." Victoria looked at their hands, his calloused from years of manual labor, hers manicured but tense, and something shifted between them. The air grew charged with possibility, with the acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name. They walked back to the office in companionable silence, the city alive around them with evening energy. At the entrance to the building, they paused. "Thank you for dinner," Marcus said, "and for the invitation. I haven't had an evening like that in longer than I can remember." "Me neither," Victoria replied. "We should do it again sometime. As friends," she added quickly, then wondered why she felt the need to qualify. "Friends," Marcus echoed, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yes, I'd like that." They stood there for a moment longer, neither quite ready to end the evening, before finally saying goodnight. Victoria watched him walk toward the subway station, his figure growing smaller in the distance, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Not hope for her son's progress or her company's success, but hope for herself. Hope that maybe she did not have to spend the rest of her life alone in her fortress of achievement. But hope, as Victoria would soon learn, could be a dangerous thing, because the more she allowed Marcus into her life, the more she trusted him with her son, the more visible their relationship became. And visibility in the ruthless ecosystem of corporate power was vulnerability. There were people watching, people who saw opportunity in the CEO's growing dependence on a former janitor, people who understood that the surest way to topple a queen was to remove the piece she had come to rely on. Richard Thornton had been on Ashford Industries' board for 12 years. He was old money, old power, and old grudges. He had opposed Victoria's appointment as CEO, had voted against her at every opportunity, and had been waiting patiently for her to make a mistake significant enough to justify her removal. The aggressive acquisition she was pursuing would, in his view, overextend the company and prove her recklessness. But acquisitions could be defended with projections and market analysis. What he needed was something more personal, more damning. He had noticed the janitor turned assistant months ago, had filed the oddity away as potentially useful. Then he had started to notice the pattern. The CEO leaving early to accommodate her troubled son, the former janitor spending hours alone with the child, the increasingly familiar way they spoke to each other, the dinner at a cozy restaurant where they sat close and laughed like old friends. Richard Thornton was a man who understood leverage, and what he was witnessing was a gift. He began to compile documentation, emails showing Victoria rearranging meetings to accommodate Ethan's needs, security footage of Marcus leaving the building with the child, records of the unusual salary Victoria was paying someone with no credentials. He built a file methodically and patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. That moment came when Victoria pushed forward with the controversial acquisition despite board resistance. Richard called an emergency board meeting, citing concerns about the CEO's judgment and fitness for leadership. Victoria walked into that board meeting expecting opposition to her business strategy. What she got was a coordinated attack on her character. Richard Thornton presented his file with surgical precision, evidence that she was allowing her son's needs to compromise company leadership, questions about the appropriateness of her relationship with a former janitor, insinuations carefully worded to avoid liability about the nature of that relationship and whether it represented a conflict of interest. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, some out of genuine concern, others out of opportunism. The acquisition had divided them, and those who opposed it saw in Richard's attack a chance to undermine Victoria's authority. By the time the meeting ended, no votes had been taken, but a line had been drawn. The board would reconvene in 1 week to discuss leadership concerns. It was in everything but name, a referendum on Victoria's position as CEO. Victoria returned to her office in a state of cold fury. She understood corporate warfare, had engaged in it many times, but this felt different. This was not about strategy or profit margins. This was personal. They were using her son, her attempt to be a better mother, as a weapon against her. And Marcus, kind, gentle Marcus, who had helped them both heal, was being framed as some kind of inappropriate liability. She called him into her office immediately. His face fell when he saw her expression. What happened? She told him everything, her voice steady but her hands shaking. Richard Thornton had turned their healing into scandal, their friendship into impropriety. The board was questioning her judgment and, by extension, questioning him. "I'm so sorry," finished. "Put you in an impossible position." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that broke her heart. "You need to distance yourself from me, publicly. If my presence is damaging your position, then I'll resign." "No," Victoria said sharply. "Absolutely not. It's exactly what they want. They want to isolate you, make you choose between your son and your company. I won't let them do that." But Marcus shook his head, his expression sad but resolved. "This isn't about what they want, Victoria. It's about what's best for you and Ethan. If I leave now, quietly, the story power. You can say it was a temporary arrangement that didn't work out. You can protect yourself. I can't let you sacrifice your career for me," Victoria said, and she realized with sudden clarity that it was true. Somewhere along the way, Marcus had become essential not just to Ethan's well-being, but to hers. Marcus reached across the desk and took her hand, the gesture now familiar and dear. "You're not sacrificing anything," he said gently. "You're making a strategic decision. That's what you do. You're brilliant at it. Don't stop now because of me." The words were reasonable, logical, exactly what a good employee would say, but Victoria heard what lay beneath them. Marcus was offering himself up, removing the vulnerability, protecting her the only way he knew how, and she was going to have to let him. Victoria Ashford did not sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse overlooking the city she had conquered, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her, and she made lists the way she always did when her world was spinning out of control. Lists of board members and their likely votes, lists of allies she could call, lists of strategic options for the coming week. But beneath all those professional calculations, one truth kept surfacing like a body in dark water. She could not let Marcus leave. It was not about Ethan, though she told herself it was. It was not about his skills or his expertise or the progress they had made, though all of that mattered. It was about the fact that Marcus Chun had become the first person in a decade who saw her as something other than a titan or an adversary or a checkbook. He saw her as human, flawed and struggling and worthy of gentleness. The thought of losing that, of going back to the sterile isolation of her previous existence, was unbearable. But she was also Victoria Ashford, and Victoria Ashford did not make decisions based on sentiment. By 3 in the morning, she had formulated a plan. She would go on the offensive. She would frame the narrative before Richard Thornton could weaponize it further. She would be transparent about Ethan's needs, about her choice to accommodate them, and she would dare the board to suggest that being a present mother made her unfit to lead. It was risky vulnerability as strategy, but it was the only path she could see that did not involve sacrificing Marcus. At 7, she called an emergency meeting with her executive team. She laid out the situation with characteristic directness, explaining the board's concerns and her plan to address them. Her CFO, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had been with her since the beginning, spoke first. "You're going to make this about motherhood versus corporate leadership. That's a minefield, Victoria." "I know," Victoria replied, "but it's the truth, and hiding from it only gives them power. We spin this as strength, not weakness. A CEO who can manage both professional excellence and personal responsibility." Her head of communications, David, looked skeptical. "With respect, the optics of the Marcus situation are complicated. A former janitor with no credentials, unusual salary, close personal relationship with you and your son. Even with the best spin, it reads as questionable judgment." "Then we change what it reads as," Victoria said firmly. "We get ahead of it. I want to give an interview, something high profile, where I control the narrative. We talk about Ethan, about the challenges of parenting a neurodivergent child, about finding unexpected help. We make Marcus a hero, not a liability." The team exchanged glances. It was bold, possibly reckless, but it was also very Victoria. They spent the next 2 hours crafting the strategy, preparing talking points, identifying the right journalist to approach. By noon, Victoria had an interview scheduled with a respected business reporter known for in-depth profiles. The interview would run in 3 days, 2 days before the reconvened board meeting. She was setting the table, forcing the narrative onto her terms, but first she needed to talk to Marcus. She found him in the sensory room with Ethan, the two of them building an elaborate structure out of connecting blocks. The concentration on her son's face was absolute, his usual anxiety replaced by focused engagement. Marcus glanced up when she entered, reading her expression immediately. "We need to talk," she said quietly. After, 30 minutes later, they sat in her office. Victoria explained her plan, watching Marcus's face cycle through surprise, concern, and something that looked like fear. "You want to put me in the spotlight," he said slowly. "Make me part of a public story." "Victoria, I can't." My past, Sophie, if people start digging, they'll find out I surrendered my license, that I walked away. It will undermine everything you're trying to accomplish. Victoria leaned forward, her voice intense. Or it will humanize you. Marcus, you're not the only person who has ever experienced tragedy and loss. What happened with Sophie was not your fault, and your response to it, the fact that you cared enough to step away rather than risk causing harm, that speaks to character. We're not hiding your past. We're owning it. We're saying that sometimes the most qualified people are the ones who have been broken and rebuilt themselves. Marcus shook his head, standing up and pacing to the window. You're asking me to expose everything I've spent 3 years trying to bury? You're asking me to be vulnerable in front of millions of people? Yes, Victoria said simply. I am, because I believe in you, Marcus. I believe your story matters. And I believe that trying to protect me by disappearing is not actually protection. It's just another way of hiding. The words hung between them. Marcus stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense, staring out at the city below. Finally, he spoke without turning around. Why does this matter so much to you? You could cut me loose, weather the storm, and move on. You've survived worse board challenges than this. Why are you willing to risk your position for me? Victoria stood and crossed to the window, standing beside him. She could see their reflections in the glass. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. Because you matter, she said quietly. Not just to Ethan. To me. I've spent my entire adult life believing I had to do everything alone, that asking for help was weakness. You've shown me that's not true. You've given me back pieces of myself I thought I lost when my husband left. I'm not giving that up without a fight. Marcus turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the same vulnerability she felt. Victoria, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I'm terrified. Of the exposure, of failing you and Ethan, of all of it. I know, she replied. I'm terrified too. Shh, but we're going to face it together, remember? That's what we promised each other. Fail better together. He nodded slowly, something settling in his expression. Okay, he said, I'll do the interview. I'll tell my story. But Victoria, you need to understand that once this is out there, there's no taking it back. If it goes wrong, if the board uses it against you anyway, I won't be able to protect you from the fallout. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. Him, then we'll face the fallout together too. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. The journalist, a woman named Eleanor Chun, who had built her reputation on nuanced profiles of complicated leaders, spent hours interviewing both Victoria and Marcus. She was sharp and perceptive, asking questions that cut to the heart of their story. Why did you trust a janitor with your son? How do you reconcile corporate leadership with single motherhood? What made you walk away from your calling, and what brought you back? Marcus struggled with the exposure, his discomfort visible in the way he chose his words carefully, paused frequently, sometimes asked to go off the record. But he persevered, and Victoria watched him excavate his own history with a courage she found breathtaking. He talked about his sister, about Sophie, about the 3 years he spent trying to disappear. He talked about the moment he saw Ethan in distress and could not walk away. He talked about the terror of allowing himself to care again, to be responsible again, to hope again. Victoria's portion of the interview was easier in some ways, harder in others. She was practiced at public speaking, at shaping narratives, but Eleanor pushed her beyond prepared talking points. Do you have feelings for Marcus Chun beyond professional respect? Eleanor asked at one point, her pen poised over her notebook. Victoria had frozen, the question hanging in the air like smoke. That's not relevant to this story, she finally said, her voice cool. Eleanor had simply smiled. Your non-answer is quite revealing, Miss Ashford. The article published on Tuesday morning splashed across the front page of the business section with a photo of Victoria and Marcus standing side by side in the sensory room, Ethan visible in soft focus in the background. The headline read, When the helper needed help, how one CEO and one janitor changed each other's lives. Victoria read it 3 times, her coffee growing cold beside her, and she felt tears threaten. Eleanor had written with empathy and insight, capturing not just the facts of their story, but its emotional truth. She wrote about the loneliness of leadership and the courage of vulnerability. She wrote about Marcus's gift and his grief. She wrote about Ethan with dignity and respect, portraying him not as a problem to be managed, but as a child deserving of understanding. The final paragraph gutted Victoria with its simple observation. Sometimes the people we hire to clean our floors end up cleaning our souls. The question is whether we're brave enough to notice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with reactions, mostly positive, but some viciously critical. Disability advocates praised Victoria's transparency. Parent groups shared the article with tearful gratitude, but corporate analysts questioned whether a CEO should be this exposed, this vulnerable. The debate raged throughout the day, building toward the board meeting scheduled for the following afternoon. Victoria spent Tuesday evening preparing her defense, running through scenarios with Patricia and David, but part of her attention was elsewhere, monitoring her phone for Marcus's response to the article. He had taken the day off, needing space to process seeing his story laid bare for public consumption. Finally, at 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed with a text. Thank you for making me brave enough to tell the truth. Whatever happens tomorrow, I don't regret it. She stared at the message, reading layers of meaning into those simple words. She typed and deleted several responses before finally settling on, You were always brave. I just helped you remember. She hesitated, then added one more line. I'm glad you're in my life, Marcus. The 3 dots appeared, indicating he was typing, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his response came through. I'm glad I'm in your life too, Victoria, more than you know. That night, unable to sleep again, Victoria did something she had not done in months. She accessed the security system and pulled up footage of the sensory room. She told herself it was preparation for the board meeting, reviewing evidence of Marcus's competence and Ethan's progress. But really, she just wanted to see them together, to remind herself what she was fighting for. She scrolled through hours of footage, watching Marcus's patient presence, her son's gradual relaxation, the small miracles of connection. Then she found something that made her breath stop. It was footage from 2 weeks ago, a day when Ethan had been particularly struggling. Victoria had been stuck in back-to-back meetings, unable to check on him, consumed with guilt. The video showed Marcus sitting with Ethan, who was rocking and nonverbal, and Marcus was talking, his words picked up by the audio feed. "I know it's hard, buddy. I know the world feels too big sometimes, but you're not alone in it. Your mom loves you so much. She's fighting battles you can't even see to make sure you have everything you need. And I'm here too. I'm not going anywhere." Then, in a moment that made Victoria's hand fly to her mouth, Marcus added quietly, almost to himself, "I love you both. You and your mom. I didn't mean to, but I do. And that makes me want to be better, to be the person you both deserve." Victoria sat in her dark office, tears streaming down her face, watching the man she had hired to clean her floors confess to her son that he loved them. She replayed the moment 3 times, memorizing his tone, his expression, the raw honesty of it. The board meeting was in 12 hours, and everything was at stake. But in that moment, Victoria Ashford made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with her heart. Win or lose tomorrow, she would tell Marcus Chun the truth. She loved him too. The boardroom felt like a courtroom. 15 people sat around the long table, their faces ranging from sympathetic to hostile, and Victoria Ashford stood at the head like a defendant preparing to argue for her life. Richard Thornton sat at the opposite end, his expression one of barely concealed satisfaction. He had read the article, of course. They all had. And while public sentiment seemed to be swinging in Victoria's favor, board members were not swayed by social media trend. They cared about risk, liability, and the bottom line. Richard opened the proceedings with surgical precision. "We're here to discuss concerns about leadership judgment and potential conflicts of interest. The recent publicity around Miss Ashford's personal situation has brought to light questions that require board oversight." He slid a folder across the table. "I've compiled documentation of instances where company resources were used for personal matters, where business decisions were compromised by childcare needs, and where inappropriate relationships with staff created liability exposure." Victoria remained standing, her posture perfect, her voice steady. "Before we review your folder, Richard, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. You're all wondering whether having an autistic son makes me unfit to lead this company. You're wondering whether my relationship with Marcus Chun represents poor judgment or something more troubling. So let me be absolutely clear about what happened and why I stand by every decision I made." She pressed a button on the remote in her hand, and the large screen behind her illuminated. For the next 20 minutes, Victoria presented her case, not with defensiveness or apology, but with data. She showed metrics proving her leadership had been more effective since Marcus joined the team, with quarterly results that exceeded projections despite the controversial acquisition. She presented documentation of accommodations other executives had received for personal matters, golf trips labeled as client development, extended lunches with spouses charged as business meals, establishing that her flexibility around Ethan's needs was not exceptional but simply more visible. Then she shifted to Marcus. She showed his credentials, his history, his expertise. She presented testimonials from his former colleagues at the pediatric center, which she had quietly gathered over the past. She showed video footage of Ethan's sessions, the measurable progress, the transformation from a child in constant crisis to one who is learning to navigate his challenge. "This is not about inappropriate favoritism," Victoria said firmly. "This is about identifying an extraordinary resource and having the wisdom to utilize it. That's what good leadership looks like." But Richard was not finished. He leaned back in his chair, his smile cold. "Very compelling, Victoria, but you've left out the most interesting part. Your relationship with Mr. Chun extends beyond professional boundaries, doesn't it? The dinners, the personal conversations, the way you look at each other in that published photograph. You've become emotionally involved with the subordinate, which creates a clear conflict of interest and exposes the company to potential liability." The room went silent. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face, not because the accusation was untrue, but because it was. She had feelings for Marcus, feelings that had grown from respect to friendship to something deeper and undeniable. But admitting it here, in this context, would be weaponized against her. She opened her mouth to respond, to deflect, to do what she always did and maintain her armor. Before she could speak, the boardroom door opened. Marcus Chun walked in, his face pale but determined. He was not scheduled to be at this meeting, had no official reason to be in the building at all. Every head turned toward him. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "but I need to say something." Victoria felt panic rising. "Marcus, you don't have to." But he held up a hand asking for her trust. "Please, let me speak." Richard Thornton's expression was one of delighted surprise. "By all means, Mr. Chun. Enlighten us. Marcus walked to the center of the room, standing beside Victoria. He looked at each board member in turn, his discomfort visible but overridden by resolve. I heard what you said about conflicts of interest and emotional involvement. You're right. There is an emotional component to my relationship with Miss Ashford and her son, but not in the way you're implying. He took a breath, steadying himself. 3 years ago, I walked away from my profession because I failed to protect a child in my care. It wasn't malpractice, it was tragedy, but I couldn't forgive myself. I spent 3 years punishing myself, hiding from the work I was meant to do, convinced I had no right to help anyone. Then I met Ethan, and he was so much like the children I used to work with, so much like my sister who I lost, and I couldn't walk away. Miss Ashford didn't seduce me or manipulate me. She gave me a chance to heal. Marcus's voice strengthened as he spoke, years of suppressed emotion finding release. You want to know about inappropriate relationships? I'll tell you what's inappropriate. It's inappropriate that in our society a single mother can't acknowledge her child's needs without being judged as. It's inappropriate that asking for help is seen as failure instead of wisdom. It's inappropriate that you're all sitting here questioning whether a CEO who increased company value by 40% is fit to lead because she dared to be human. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Several looked down at their hands, but Richard was unmoved. Stirring speech, Mr. Chun, but it doesn't address the core issue. You've admitted to emotional involvement. That creates liability. Victoria should have disclosed the nature of your relationship and recused herself from decisions regarding your employment. Her failure to do so represents a breach of fiduciary duty. Victoria felt the trap closing. Richard was right on technical grounds, and the board knew it. She had let her personal feelings compromise her professional judgment, and now it would cost her everything. But as she prepared to resign, to fall on her sword to protect the company she had built, Marcus spoke again. Actually, Richard, you're wrong about one thing. The emotional involvement you're concerned about, it's not what you think. He turned to Victoria, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her heart stop. I haven't been hiding a romantic relationship with Miss Ashford, but I have been hiding something else. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. For the past 3 weeks, I've been documenting my sessions with Ethan with his mother's permission, creating a clinical record of his progress. I've been doing this because I was considering applying to have my therapeutic license reinstated. I wanted evidence that I could still do this work safely and effectively. He pressed play on the device. The boardroom filled with audio from a session. Ethan's voice excited as he described a pattern he had discovered. Marcus's gentle encouragement, the sound of their laughter. But what really matters, Marcus continued, stopping the playback, is what this represents. I've been so focused on my own fear that I forgot something crucial. I'm not just helping Ethan. I'm documenting a new therapeutic approach that could help thousands of children like him. Miss Ashford didn't hire me out of emotional weakness. She identified an opportunity to pioneer something revolutionary. Victoria stared at him, understanding dawning. Marcus turned back to the board. What I'm proposing is this. Ashford Industries creates a new division focused on developing and licensing innovative therapeutic approaches for neurodivergent children. I'll lead the research and development, working with credentialed partners. Miss Ashford provides the business structure and funding. We turn what you're calling a liability into a profitable, socially responsible enterprise. We're not hiding a scandal. We're building something that matters. The shift in the room was palpable. What had been an ethics violation suddenly sounded like innovation. What had been questionable judgment now looked like vision. Patricia, Victoria's CFO, spoke up for the first time. The therapy market for autism spectrum disorders is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If we could develop and patent new approaches, the revenue potential is significant. Plus, the CSR benefits would be substantial. Other board members began nodding, seeing the opportunity, but Victoria was focused only on Marcus, on what he had just done. He had taken the weapon being used against them and transformed it into a shield. More than that, he had found a way to honor his calling, to help children like Ethan, without the crushing pressure of individual clinical responsibility. He had, in one brilliant moment, saved them both. Richard Thornton's face had gone from triumphant to furious. He stood abruptly. This is absurd. You can't seriously be considering turning a personnel problem into a business venture. It's desperate. Several board members looked at him, and Victoria saw in their expressions that Richard had overplayed his hand. His vendetta was too obvious. His resistance to a potentially profitable idea too personal. The board chairwoman, a shrewd woman named Margaret who had remained neutral throughout, finally spoke. Richard, I think you've made your concerns clear, but I'm inclined to explore Marcus's proposal. It addresses the ethical questions you've raised while potentially benefiting the company. I move that we table the leadership review and instead authorize a feasibility study for this new therapeutic division. Who seconds? 4 hands went up immediately. The vote was called. The motion passed 9-6. Victoria felt her knees go weak with relief. She had survived. More than survived, she had emerged with a path forward that honored everything she and Marcus had built together. Richard Thornton gathered his papers with angry, jerky movements and left the room without another word. The other board members filed out, some offering congratulations, others simply relieved the uncomfortable confrontation was over. When the room finally cleared, Victoria turned to Marcus. They stood alone in the vast boardroom, the city stretching out beyond the floor. 2 ceiling windows. How did you? She started, then stopped, overwhelmed. You planned that. You knew what Richard was going to say, and you prepared a counter. Marcus smiled, a tired but genuine expression. I learned from the best. You taught me that sometimes the best defense is a brilliant offense. Victoria crossed the space between them in 3 strides. She meant to shake his hand to thank him professionally, but instead she wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder. You saved everything. Marcus held her carefully as if she might break. We saved each other, he replied quietly. That's what we do. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate sorrows and built something neither had expected. When Victoria finally pulled back, she looked up at him and saw in his eyes the same truth she had witnessed on the security footage. He loved her. The knowledge settled in her chest like warmth. But before she could speak, before she could tell him what she had discovered in the middle of the night, her phone buzzed urgently. It was the school. There had been another incident with Ethan, more serious this time. He had run from the playground and locked himself in the school library, and he was asking for Marcus. Not his mother, not his teachers, but Marcus. They needed to come immediately. The triumph of the board meeting evaporated, replaced by familiar parental fear. Victoria looked at Marcus, and without words they moved as one toward the elevator. Whatever declarations needed to be made, whatever feelings needed to be acknowledged would have to wait, because a little boy needed them, and that would always come first. They found Ethan in the corner of the school library, wedged between 2 tall bookshelves where the afternoon light barely reached. The librarian, a gentlewoman named Mrs. Patterson, stood at a respectful distance, her face creased with worry. He won't come out, she explained in a hushed voice. He keeps saying everything is wrong, that he can't make it right. We tried to calm him, but he only got more agitated. Then he asked for someone named Marcus, and we didn't know who that was until we called his mother. Victoria felt guilt slam into her chest. Her son's support system was so fragile, so dependent on one person who, until months ago, had been a stranger. What kind of mother had she become? But Marcus was already moving past her, approaching the bookshelves with the unhurried calm that seemed to be his superpower. He sat down on the floor several feet from where Ethan was hidden, close enough to be present, but far enough to not crowd him. Hey buddy, Marcus said quietly. I heard you needed me, so I came. You don't have to come out if you're not ready. I'll just sit here with you for a while, okay? There was silence. Then Ethan's small voice emerged from the shadows. They laughed at me. The words were thick with tears. I tried to tell them about the pattern I discovered in the clouds, the way they move in Fibonacci sequences, and they laughed. They said I was weird and wrong and that I make everything wrong. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to demand names, to find these children and make them understand the cruelty of their dismissal. But Marcus remained perfectly still, his voice steady. You're not wrong, Ethan. You're different, and different scares people sometimes. But the patterns you see, they're real. The world is full of patterns, and you're one of the lucky people who can see them clearly. That doesn't make you wrong. It makes you rare. Pause. Then Ethan's tear-streaked face appeared at the edge of the bookshelf. But I don't want to be rare, he whispered. I want to be normal. I want friends who don't laugh. Marcus nodded, his expression full of understanding that came from lived experience. I know. My sister used to say the same thing. She saw the world differently too, and it was hard for her. But you know what? The people who laughed at you, they're missing out, because you see beauty in clouds that they'll never notice. You understand rhythms and patterns that make the universe make sense. That's a gift, even when it feels like a burden. Slowly, incrementally, Ethan emerged from his hiding place. He sat next to Marcus, not quite touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. Will I always feel like this? Ethan asked, his voice small and defeated. Like I don't fit? Marcus considered the question seriously. Sometimes yes, but you'll also find people who fit with you. People who think your patterns are fascinating instead of weird. People who want to learn from you instead of laugh at you. And that makes the hard days worth it. Ethan looked up at Marcus with eyes full of desperate hope. Like you fit with me. Marcus's breath caught. Yeah, buddy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Like me, I fit with you. And Victoria watched this exchange, standing back with Mrs. Patterson, and she felt something crack open inside her chest. This was not a therapeutic intervention. This was love. Pure, unconditional, the kind that did not demand perfection or progress or anything except showing up. The ride home was quiet. Ethan sat in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional storm, while Victoria drove and Marcus sat in the passenger seat. They had not discussed where Marcus would go. He had simply gotten into her car, and she had simply driven toward home. It felt natural, inevitable, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of months. When they arrived at Victoria's brownstone, Marcus helped Ethan inside, guided him through his calming routine, and sat with him until he fell asleep on the couch under his weighted blanket. Victoria stood in the doorway watching them, her successful board meeting suddenly feeling distant and unimportant. She had won the battle to keep her position, had even turned a potential scandal into a business opportunity. But what she had won felt empty compared to this. The quiet peace of her son sleeping safely while the man who had saved them both sat guardian beside him. When Marcus finally stood and crossed to where she waited, she felt tears threatening again. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I lose my courage. Marcus looked at her. concern flickering across his features. What is it? Victoria gestured toward her home office. Come with me. There's something you need to see. She opened her laptop, pulling up the security footage she had watched the night before. The clip of Marcus talking to Ethan, confessing his feelings to a child who could not understand the weight of what was being said. She pressed play. They watched together in silence as Marcus's recorded voice filled the room. I love you both, you and your mom. I didn't mean to, but I do. Victoria paused the video and turned to Marcus. His face had gone pale, a mix of shock and horror at having his most private moment exposed. You watched this, he said, and it was not quite a question. You've been watching me. Victoria felt shame wash over her. I know. I violated your privacy. I was preparing for the board meeting, looking for evidence of your work with Ethan, and I found this instead. I should have stopped watching. I should have deleted it. But Marcus, I couldn't because you said something I needed to hear. Marcus stepped back, his expression closing off. This is why you fought so hard today? Because you felt guilty about spying on me? Because you felt obligated? No, Victoria said urgently, reaching for his hand. Because what you said, it's true for me too. I love you. I didn't mean to. I told myself it was just gratitude, just respect, just friendship. But it's more, you've become essential to me, Marcus. Not just for what you do for Ethan, but for who you are. And I'm terrified because I don't know how to do this, how to be vulnerable, how to need someone. But I need you. Marcus stared at her, emotions warring across his face. Anger at the invasion of privacy battled with hope at her confession. You can't say this now, he finally managed. Not after today, not after everything. How do I know this is real and not just adrenaline from surviving the board meeting? How do I know you won't wake up tomorrow and realize you've made a terrible mistake? Because I've known for weeks, Victoria said, stepping closer. I've known every time you made me laugh, every time you saw me struggling and offered help without judgment, every time you looked at my son with such tenderness it made my heart ache. I've been in love with you, Marcus Chun, probably since the night you sat on my hallway floor and played with a flashlight. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until I thought I might lose you. Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his cheek. Can't be what you need, he whispered. I'm still broken, Victoria. I still wake up some mornings convinced I'm going to fail, that I'm going to hurt someone, that I'm not worthy of this. How can I be what you and Ethan need when I can barely trust myself? Victoria reached up and gently wiped the tear from his face. Then we'll be broken together. You told me once that sometimes the best thing we can do is fail better together, remember? Well, I'm asking you to succeed with me, to build something with me, to love me even though I'm controlling and workaholic and terrible at being vulnerable. Marcus opened his eyes, and in them she saw the same terrified hope she felt. If we do this, he said slowly, if we try this, we have to be honest. No more watching security footage without permission. No more hiding feelings or fears. If this is going to work, we have to trust each other completely. Victoria nodded. Complete honesty. I promise, starting now. He took a breath. I'm scared that you'll realize I'm not worth the trouble, that my life is too complicated, my son too challenging, my career too demanding. I'm scared you'll leave like my husband did. Marcus took her hands in his, holding them firmly. I'm scared too, he admitted. I'm scared I'll let you down, that I'll freeze when you need me most, that I'm not capable of being the partner you deserve. But Victoria, I've spent 3 years running from fear, and it almost destroyed me. I don't want to run anymore. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Then we'll be brave together. They stood like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing in sync. Then Marcus pulled back slightly and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. So what happens now? Victoria smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in years. Now we figure it out. Together, we'll make mistakes, probably lots of them, but we'll face them together. Marcus leaned down and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, a kiss that tasted of relief and promise and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. From the living room came a small voice. Are you kissing Marcus, Mom? They turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his weighted blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a cape, looking at them with curiosity rather than distress. Victoria felt her face flush, but Marcus laughed, the sound free and genuine. Is that okay with you, buddy? Ethan considered the question seriously. Does this mean Marcus will be here more? Because I like when he's here. Everything feels safer. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different. These were happy. Yes, she said softly. Marcus will be here more if that's okay with everyone. Ethan nodded decisively. It's okay. He walked over to them and wrapped his arms around both their legs simultaneously, creating a small 3-person embrace. I like our family. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of acceptance and hope. Victoria looked at Marcus over their son's head, and she saw her own wonder reflected back at her. They had started as CEO and janitor, brought together by corporate cruelty and a child's needs. But somewhere along the way, they had become something else entirely. They had become a family. But even as Victoria felt happiness settling into her bones, she knew one challenge remained. Richard Thornton had been defeated but not destroyed. His vendetta would not end with one lost board vote. And tomorrow, when the news of her relationship with Marcus became public, when the gossip mill started churning, she would face her greatest test yet. not of her business acumen or her leadership ability, but of her willingness to choose love over image, family over reputation, authentic life over carefully curated success. She looked at Marcus, at Ethan, at this impossible family they had built from broken pieces, and she knew exactly what choice she would make. The email arrived at 6 in the morning, 2 days after Victoria and Marcus had confessed their feelings to each other. It came from an anonymous account, sent to every board member, every senior executive, and 20 major shareholders. The subject line read simply, "The truth about your CEO." Victoria stared at her phone screen, her coffee growing cold in her hand as she opened the attachment. It was a dossier, professionally compiled with timestamps and documentation, security footage of her and Marcus holding hands in her office, records of dinners charged to company accounts, text messages between them that had somehow been accessed, and a narrative that framed everything in the worst possible light. CEO Victoria Ashford has engaged in an inappropriate relationship with subordinate Marcus Chun, compromising her professional judgment and creating massive liability for the company. She has used company resources for personal benefit, shown preferential treatment to a romantic partner, and prioritized her personal life over fiduciary responsibility. This is not leadership. This is scandal waiting to explode. Richard Thornton's digital signature was nowhere on the document, but his fingerprints were all over it. He was forcing the board's hand, creating a crisis they could not ignore. Victoria's phone began ringing before 7. Patricia, her CFO, was first. "We need damage control now." By 8, an emergency board meeting had been called for that afternoon. By 9, reporters were calling for comment. The story was spreading like wildfire through business media circles. Victoria Ashford, the untouchable CEO, caught in a relationship with a former janitor. The narrative was too juicy, too perfectly crafted for the scandal machine to resist. Marcus arrived at her office at 10, his face drawn with guilt. "This is my fault. I should have stayed away. I should have known this would happen." Victoria stood and crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. "Stop. This is not your fault. This is Richard Thornton being vindictive and calculating. But Marcus, I need to know. Are you prepared for what's coming? Because it's going to get ugly." Marcus covered her hands with his. "I've already lost everything once. I survived it. I'll survive this too, as long as you're with me." The board meeting that afternoon was brutal. Richard Thornton had rallied his faction, presenting the dossier's irrefutable evidence of Victoria's unfitness to lead. The room was split. Some members disgusted by the invasion of privacy, others genuinely concerned about the liability and optics. For 2 hours they debated her fate while Victoria sat silent, letting them argue over her life as if she were not present. Finally, Margaret, the board chair, called for order. "Enough. We've heard the accusations and the defenses. Now I want to hear from Victoria. Tell us in your own words what you want us to understand." Victoria stood, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had prepared a speech, a carefully crafted defense that addressed every point professionally and dispassionately. But standing there, facing the people who would decide her future, she discarded it all. "I fell in love with Marcus Chun," she said simply. "Not because I planned to, not because it was strategic or appropriate, but because he is a good man who helped my son when no one else could. He saw me at my most vulnerable and did not judge. He accepted my imperfections and made me want to be better. Yes, I made mistakes in how I handled the situation. Yes, I should have been more transparent about the evolving nature of our relationship, but I will not apologize for choosing to build a life with someone who makes me and my son happier than we've been in years." She looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes. "You can fire me if you want. You can decide that a CEO who falls in love is unfit to lead. But know this, in the months since Marcus came into my life, this company has thrived. Profits are up. Employee satisfaction is up. We've opened a new division that could revolutionize pediatric therapy and generate millions in revenue. I have been more focused, more effective, and more present than I was when I was running on empty, pretending I didn't need anyone. So ask yourselves, what kind of leadership do you actually want? Someone who sacrifices everything, including their humanity, for the company? Or someone who understands that being whole makes them stronger?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then Margaret spoke, her voice measured. "I move that we table this matter pending an independent investigation into whether any company policies were actually violated. In the meantime, Victoria remained CEO with full authority." The vote was 8-7. Victoria had survived by a single vote, but she had survived. That evening, emotionally exhausted and drained, Victoria returned home to find Marcus and Ethan in the kitchen making dinner. It was such a domestic scene, so beautifully normal that she felt tears threatening again. "How did it go?" Marcus asked, though her face probably told him everything. "By one vote," she said. "I'm still CEO. For now." Ethan ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm glad. I don't want you to lose your job because of us." Victoria knelt down to his level. "Baby, you're not the reason for any of this. You're the best part of my life. Don't ever think otherwise." After dinner, after Ethan was settled in bed, Victoria sat in her home office reviewing security protocols. The breach that had allowed Richard to access her text messages and personal footage needed to be addressed. Her head of security had sent over a report, and she was methodically working through it when she noticed something. There was a notation about footage that had been flagged but not accessed. From the executive floor, multiple instances over several months months where the motion sensors had been triggered after hours but no one was visible on camera. Her security chief had assumed it was a technical glitch, but Victoria felt a cold dread forming in her stomach. She pulled up the flagged footage, scrolling through dates. Most showed exactly what was noted: empty corridors with inexplicable motion sensor alerts. Then she found one from 3 weeks ago that made her blood run cold. The camera showed the corridor outside the sensory room. The timestamp read 11:30 at night, long after everyone should have been gone. At first, the hallway appeared empty. Then Richard Thornton stepped into frame, clearly thinking he was alone. He tried the door to the sensory room, found it locked, and pulled out a set of keys. Victoria's hands began to shake. Those were master keys, the kind only senior executives had. He entered the sensory room and was inside for 4 minutes. Victoria immediately pulled up footage from inside the sensory room for that same time frame. What she saw made her breath stop. Richard had gone through everything. He had photographed Marcus's notes, rifled through drawers, and worst of all, he had accessed the computer where session recordings were stored. He had stolen documentation of Ethan's therapy sessions, private moments between her son and Marcus. This was not just corporate espionage. This was a violation of her child. But then, as Victoria was about to close the footage, something else appeared on screen. It was dated the same night, 2 hours later. Marcus entered the sensory room, clearly having forgotten something. He picked up a notebook from the desk, then paused. He looked around the room and his face changed. He noticed things were slightly out of place. Papers not quite as he'd left them. He opened drawers, checking, and his expression grew alarmed. Then he did something that made Victoria's chest tighten. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording a video message. "If someone is watching this," he said to the camera, "I want you to know that Ethan is a remarkable child. Whatever you found in this room, whatever you think you can use, remember that you're dealing with a child's private struggles. He deserves dignity and privacy, and if you use this information to hurt him or his mother, you'll have to live with the knowledge that you weaponized a child's pain for personal gain. Can you do that? Can you look at yourself and be okay with that?" He set down his phone, and for the next 10 minutes, the security footage captured him sitting alone in the sensory room, his head in his hands. Then he did something extraordinary. He began to reorganize everything meticulously, putting it all back exactly as it had been. But he also did something else. He took out his personal notebook and wrote something, then placed it prominently on the desk where anyone reviewing the room would find it. Victoria zoomed in on the footage, trying to read what he had written. The words came into focus. "To whoever disturbed this room, know that Ethan Ashford is under my protection now. Whatever you're planning, whatever move you're making, you'll have to go through me first. And I promise you I will not make it easy." The date on the footage was 3 weeks ago, days before Richard's dossier appeared. Marcus had known. He had discovered the break-in, had understood they were being targeted, and he had said nothing. He had simply positioned himself as a shield between the threat and the people he loved. Victoria sat in her dark office, tears streaming down her face, watching this man who had been broken by guilt and failure choose to be brave anyway, choose to protect them anyway. She watched him sit in that quiet room, preparing for a battle he knew was coming, and she understood something profound. Marcus had not just helped Ethan heal. He had not just helped her learn to be vulnerable. He had shown them both what true courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to show up anyway, to protect what mattered anyway, to love anyway. She found him in the living room, reading on the couch. She sat beside him without speaking, pulled out her phone, and showed him the footage. He watched his own image, his expression unreadable. When it finished, he looked at her. "You knew," she said softly. "You knew Richard had violated the sensory room, and you didn't tell me." Marcus nodded slowly. "I didn't want to worry you. You had enough to deal with. So you decided to deal with it alone," she said. And it was not quite a question. "I decided to protect my family," he replied simply. The words, spoken so naturally, made Victoria's tears start fresh. She leaned against him and he wrapped his arms around her. "I watched you prepare to face him alone," she whispered. "I watched you write that note, putting yourself between us and danger. And Marcus, I have never felt more loved in my entire life." He kissed the top of her head. "That's what family does. We protect each other." 3 months later, the independent investigation concluded. Richard Thornton was removed from the board for gross misconduct after evidence of his break-in emerged. Victoria was cleared of all wrongdoing, with the investigators noting that while her relationship with Marcus had been unconventional, it had not violated any company policies. The new therapeutic division she and Marcus had proposed was officially launched, with Marcus as director and a team of credentialed therapists working under him. But the real victory happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the sensory room. Ethan was working with a new child, a little girl who had just been diagnosed and was terrified of everything. Victoria watched through the window as her son, now 9 years old and thriving, showed the little girl his flashlight patterns, the same patterns Marcus had once shown him. "It's okay to be scared," he told her gently, "but there are people who understand. You're not alone." Victoria felt Marcus's hand slip into hers. She leaned against him, watching their son become a helper, a healer, carrying forward the gift Marcus had given him. "This is what it was all for," Marcus said softly. "This moment right here." Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. They had started as CEO and Janitor, had been brought together by cruelty and chance, had fought through scandal and doubt, but they had emerged as something neither had imagined. They had become a family built on the radical idea that being broken did not disqualify you from love, that needing help was not weakness. that sometimes the people who clean your floors end up cleaning your soul, and that was the greatest success Victoria Ashford had ever achieved.